Welcome to Reporting Climate Justice, Grassroots Efforts, Resistance, and Radical Change. My name is Anita Varma, and I lead the Solidarity Journalism Initiative at the Center for Media Engagement. We're recording this on June 9th, 2023, at the end of a week when people in Canada and the East Coast of the United States have experienced extremely poor air quality due to wildfires in Canada. As many of you probably know, the current wildfires are by no means the only recent examples of climate crisis. Cyclone Freddie, flooding in Pakistan, intense hurricanes, and record-breaking heat across the world are just a few examples of ways that we know climate change is real and that millions of people are already affected by climate injustice. In distressing times, sometimes the best way to begin is by coming together, which is what we're doing today through this workshop space. And I'm very excited to introduce you to our two panelists who will share important insights aimed at helping journalists and journalism students improve news coverage of climate justice issues. First, allow me to introduce Brooke Anderson, who is a freelance photographer and photojournalist based on unceded Ohlone land in Oakland, California. She covers movements for social, economic, racial, and climate justice. Brooke first fell in love with photography while documenting the struggles of low-wage workers, including hotel housekeepers, port truck drivers, and recycling workers when she was working as a union and community organizer. Her work can most recently be found in Teen Vogue, Yes Magazine, and In These Times. She is a proud union member of the Pacific Media Workers Guild, CWA 39521 AFL-CIO. Second, I am equally excited to introduce Jayeesha Dutta. Jayeesha is a Bangladeshi-USAn who works at the intersections of healing justice, creative facilitation, grassroots media making, and cultural organizing. She is a co-founding member of the Another Gulf is Possible collaborative, program director at the Windcall Institute, and co-chair of the board for Eyewitness Palestine. Joy-i-sha currently lives in Port St Lucie, Florida, lands of the Eyewitness people who for generations prior to colonization were the stewards of the Indian River Lagoon region, one of the most biodiverse places in the world. Welcome to both of our panelists. Thank you both for being here. In terms of format, I will start by providing a few words about solidarity and solidarity journalism, and then I'll turn things over to Brooke and Jayeesha for their opening comments, where they'll situate themselves a little bit more. After that, I'll pose some questions for our panelists related to helping all of you cover climate justice issues, and then we will have a moment to wrap up and conclude, but hopefully to continue the conversation through other channels as well. So I'm just going to share my screen to get started. All right. So as some of you know, I research, teach, and do public engagement all about this idea of solidarity in journalism. And what I always try to do first is to define what it is I mean when I say solidarity. So solidarity, as I define it, is a commitment to social justice that translates into action. When social justice means dignity for everyone in a society. So dignity means very basically respecting everyone's humanity. And basic humanity requires access to clean air, clean water, sufficient food, and safe shelter. None of these things are privileges per se, right? For basic human survival, these are necessities. And these are all necessities that climate change places at risk and places at risk disproportionately for people in disproportionately impacted areas. So one clarification is that solidarity does not require that we are all personally or proportionally affected by an injustice. It does, however, require that we act on a principled commitment to upholding everyone's basic dignity. In other words, you yourself may not be impacted by a climate justice issue today, although that could very well change tomorrow. But in solidarity, this would mean that we still not only pay attention, but take action to try to address climate injustice that may be affecting people who we have not met. So in journalism, this takes the form of a particular type of reporting that I've been calling solidarity reporting, which is a commitment to social justice that translates into the action of reporting that prioritizes the firsthand knowledge, needs, and insights of people whose dignity is at stake. Really importantly, solidarity reporting moves beyond narratives of sorrow, of tragedy, of helplessness, to instead look at how people are at a grassroots level reclaiming and demanding modes of empowerment. This happens through representing what people know and what people know that they need, as well as ongoing grassroots efforts to address injustice. So to be clear, in solidarity reporting, we may also hear from officials, from scientists, from outside analysts. They might be included as well, but they would not be placed at the top of the story. They would not be, in other words, primary definers or the people setting the terms for discussion. One reason for that is that we see that when officials across a range of political interests are placed at the top of climate change coverage, they may wish to minimize, to deny, or simply to ignore the existence of climate injustice at all. So as you think about how to do some solidarity reporting on climate justice issues, I want to underscore the fact that, as we'll hear from our panelists, there are some distinctive aspects of approaching this story, but there's also some aspects that are really the same as any story you might do that is pursuing truthful journalism. And these start with questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how. So solidarity reporting on climate justice issues would start with a question of trying to figure out who is impacted by climate injustice and who is working to address it at a grassroots level. This reporting would ask what are their insights, needs, and collective demands for change. Would also try to represent when climate injustice began. It certainly did not begin just this week, right? And if grassroots movements' demands were met, what would the timeline be for change? What is the trajectory? What is the timeline for seeing differences out in the world? Where is climate injustice happening? And this is unlikely to be just one location, but what are the interconnections between the range of regions affected? And why are some people disproportionately impacted by climate injustice? This is a question that has just begun to get the level of media attention it deserves, to the extent of recognizing that places and people disproportionately impacted have not contributed the largest amount to pollution and environmental damage. So those disconnects are part of reporting the truth of what's happening in climate justice stories and stories of efforts to address these in solidarity. The final question is one that hopefully centers hope, which is how could climate injustice end? There's lots of doomsday narratives, there's lots of reasons for alarm, but the most important aspect of grassroots organizing is that it's not just an activity for the sake of itself, but an activity trying to advance a vision for how transformation is still indeed possible. And solidarity reporting would represent the truth of those efforts and visions. So with that, I will turn things over now to Brooke to offer us some situating comments in how she enters the space of looking at climate justice issues.
Hi, y'all. Thank you to Anita for putting this together, and just also so excited to be in community and in a conversation with Joy-i-sha. I wanted to just share a little bit. I always think, I'm a photographer, and so I always think visually, and so it's hard for me not to want to show photos when I talk. So I wanted to just share a little bit more background, and then also maybe share some photos so you can see some of my reporting, get a sense of the work that I do. But maybe the first thing I'll say is, just to add texture and nuance to the bio that Anita put out, we'll name, I came up in downstate Illinois in a smaller town called Champaign-Urbana, and my entry into this work was fighting medical waste incinerators when I think I was like 16 or 17 years old. Folks may know the way these incinerators work is when they burn any plastics. So think about all the plastic that's in a hospital. IV bags, tubing, releases really dangerous dioxin into the air that's responsible for a host of things like cancer. Kids in the neighborhood were getting headaches, asthma, nosebleeds, and we shut down a medical waste incinerator. And I was like, oh my God, whatever the thing is we just did. I was working with folks, was not a nonprofit, just community activists and organizers. I was like, that's the thing I want to do with my life. And eventually needed a job and became a union organizer and came up organizing hotel workers, port truck drivers, recycling workers, and saw in each of these campaigns that the transitions that were happening in the economy that were responding to collapse of our ecosystems were disproportionately putting the burden of transitioning our economy to realign it with Earth's living systems, putting the burden on those workers, predominantly working class workers, immigrant workers, workers of color, putting the burden on those workers who had contributed the least to climate chaos and had the least resources to shoulder that burden. And so got really re-excited about climate justice. And one of the things I'm regretting not putting in my bio is I spent many, many years at the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. And through that work, ended up just really falling in love with storytelling and trying to figure out, okay, what does it look like to tell some of these stories that we that aren't making the news around climate justice or aren't getting their fair share. So I wanted to share 3 articles that I recently put out, just to give you a flavor of the work. This one's in Teen Vogue. It's super fun to be in an article that was also about like, what did folks wear to the, I don't even know, whatever the ball is and the latest lip gloss and whatnot. But was a really fun piece that I wrote about youth versus apocalypse. And they're young BIPOC organizers that are fighting in particular to divest the public pension system in California from Line 3 and from other fossil fuel and extractive projects and so on, to just share some fun photos from this piece so that you can get a sense of it. And, you know, some of this was coming at a time in which we'd seen so much attention on young activists like Greta Thunberg and other folks, while there were all of these youth of color in particular that were coming out of impacted communities who live next to the refineries, live next to the incinerators, whose brilliance was not being put forward or was not getting the kind of stage that it should have had. And then a recent piece from Yes Magazine that focuses on the farm workers up in the North Bay. So for folks who know, the grape harvest season and wildfire season are increasingly corresponding, where we're seeing workers who are picking grapes in the midst of tremendous wildfire smoke and are being escorted by bosses through the evacuation zones as quote unquote essential workers to continue to make these astronomical profits for a wine industry that is contributing to monoculture cropping, to water waste, to chemical inputs into the land. And these farm workers over time have drawn down resources from state and federal government, from private foundations to do ecological restoration work, and just did the first in the country Spanish language controlled burn training, and who are now in a worker governed sort of worker cooperative type way doing ecological restoration and vegetation management work, which is so exciting. Just since we're talking about the wildfire smoke that is blanketing the Northeast right now, I thought I would share. This is a little bit of an older piece that I did for In These Times, but in 2018, when California, one of the many times California was choking down hazardous wildfire smoke. And wildfire makes it sound like it's smoke that comes from trees, but you really have to imagine it's anything that goes up in flames in the middle of a fire. So things from paint cans to light bulbs to batteries, all the toxins in the air. I got curious, especially as a union organizer, about what does this mean for workers, and just asked all the workers I could find, from landscapers to traffic coordinators. And so I just want to show these 3 pieces as an example of the work that I've done, and excited to be in conversation and hear what other folks are working on.
Thank you so much, Brooke. Those are fantastic examples. Jayeesha, would love to turn it over to you to hear about your work and how you enter the space.
Sure. And I'm going to start with myself, but then I would love to actually show the animation for Another Gulf is Possible. It's about 2.5 minutes. So hopefully I hope it works when I do the share screen, because we didn't practice it. So yeah, I as you shared, I'm a Bangladeshi US American, born in Mobile, Alabama, and moved around quite a bit as an immigrant child. You know, the ancestral lands that my family is from, as well as my kind of adopted homelands in the Gulf South, particularly New Orleans, was home for me for about a dozen years before I moved here to Florida, not necessarily by choice, but by obligation for my family, which is still a very climate vulnerable place. Part of my, coming to climate justice was not, it wasn't the first movement I was part of, is not my original movement home. I entered the work as a young person myself during the kind of crux of the AIDS epidemic in the 90s, and did a lot of work around that at the very kind of beginning of my activism. And then I got, really involved in education justice and youth organizing for quite some time in my 20s into my 30s. And then after moving to New Orleans, the school system there is super, super complicated and difficult. And so as somebody who has a commitment to creating empowering spaces for young people, I just couldn't stay in that space anymore, and actually went back to labor organizing, which I studied industrial labor relations in college and didn't go into the union world. But Brooke and I have a common colleague and friend named Mateo, who I actually met in 1996 during an AFL-CIO kind of boot camp. And that was my boot camp to organizing. So little stint there in the labor world, also very difficult in Louisiana to do that work. And a friend of mine who was at the time coordinating a coalition of those at the time 60 organizations across the Gulf Coast, united in the wake of the BP oil disaster. I took that role part-time. It was not a part-time role. It turned out to be a full-time role, and that was kind of my entry into the work. I've learned over the years in this kind of field, and I've actually I'm kind of adjacent to the climate justice world as my center point these days, doing more healing justice work now with the Windcall Institute. But in the founding of Another Gulf is Possible, which I'll show our video, we're really trying to center the intersections of climate justice alongside art, culture, storytelling, healing, and transformative justice. Because if we don't right our relationship with ourselves and with each other, we're not going to be able to do it for the planet. And that seems like a part of the equation that's oftentimes missing in the climate justice spaces I'm part of. We sometimes replicate that toxicity that we are fighting in, that Brooke was just talking about. We replicate that in the dynamics and relationships we have with each other. So that's part of the kind of attention that I give to the work that I do, and I feel is part of probably what I'll be talking about today in terms of the, journalists and doing that same kind of relational considerations and understanding as they go forward to kind of get the story.
Many moons ago, the people of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean had a sacred relationship with the land, the water, and for the most part, with each other too, respecting cycles and rhythms of the planet.
Then, about 500 years ago, European colonists came and disrupted this precious balance. They stole land, labor, and lives to build the country we now call the United States. Over the last 150 years, violence and abuse of people continued while also exploiting the land and water.
The U.S. Gulf South especially became a sacrifice zone for the country, turning this once beautiful wonderland into a wasteland of oil, gas, and chemical industry. Pollution and environmental disasters have led to public health crises. Some places are called Cancer Alley, and children play while suffering from asthma, surrounded by industrial pollution.
Adding insult to the region, our climate is also changing, and we are sinking into the sea at one of the fastest rates in the world. In Louisiana, We are losing almost a football field of wetlands every hour. These wetlands serve as protection against increasingly terrible hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. Communities living on the Gulf of Mexico and in the Caribbean are experiencing the worst of this already. From Hurricanes Katrina to Maria, we know how catastrophic these climate-related events can be.
But together, we believe another Gulf is possible, where we can survive and thrive without fear of each other, free of oppression, where we can live in balance with our natural resources, our land and our water, and still meet our energy needs.
Where we can eat and live with better health and connection to each other and to the planet.
Where we can take care of each other and have everyone feel honored, respected, and loved.
It will take all of us believing there is a way to protect our people and our planet, and then working together to make that reality come true.
Join us!
Yeah, so I think that to me wraps up a lot of the just transition perspective as it comes from the Gulf South. I know when I did my movement generation boot camp, Brooke was on staff there at MG. So yeah, definitely a shout out to Movement Generation for kind of building the framework that we're really trying to live out in real time here in the Gulf South.
Thank you so much. I adore that video. We can include a link so people can bookmark it and share it as well, separate from our talk. And I think it's such a good segue into the first question that I'd love to pose to both of you, because I feel like what we just saw in that video is such a clear example of how media coming from within organizing efforts and movement groups can be so compelling and intensely humanizing and engaging, and yet we don't always see the same happen in media coming from outside of movements, but attempting to cover them. So I wonder, in the context of news coverage of climate justice efforts, what are some, we can call them errors, we can call them distortions, or we could call it outright false claims that you've seen and noticed that are coming up and really not an accurate portrayal of the work that's happening on the ground? When anyone can start. Brooke, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I think the things that come to mind for me were so highlighted by that Gulf South, Gulf Coast animation, that, you know, there's a reason why it started with the theft of land, labor, and life, which is that, you know, climate is the consequence of the system. It's the symptom of the system, not the problem itself, right? Is that the real crisis that we're in is rooted in slavery and genocide. You know, one of the things that we say all the time is like, what you do to the land, you do to the people, what you do to the people, you do to the land. That you know, sort of social inequity inevitably leads to ecological erosion. And so, you know, I think so many times we see sort of climate as its own separate problem in the media. And I think, you know, there's nothing could be further from the truth. And so I think that's really important, because when we see journalism that talks about climate solutions, if we're not putting those solutions through a lens that sort of says, okay, well, anything that exacerbates existing social, economic, ecological, racial inequity, that's a false solution, right? So, you know, in particular, if it started with slavery and genocide, any solution must include reparations and land back, you know, bare minimum. But that's not often what we hear about, right? I think, you know, the other thing we hear all the time is like, technology will save us, right? And they don't literally say those words, but so much of what we hear in climate reporting is like, oh, this thing about solar panels, about carbon capture and sequestration, about geoengineering, about synthetic biology, as opposed to the actual radical reorganization of society, about really returning land and labor and life back into the web of life that puts us back into a place where we have this reflexive and responsive relationship to land and to water and to each other. And it really devolves governance down to the bioregional level, the like, how are we governing at the level of the thing we're trying to govern? It just, you know, that wildfire story, that I was sharing, there's a sentence in there where the workers are talking about like, well, actually, you know, because we get paid by the I forget what it is, like the cart or something like that, not by the hour, it actually made sense for us to continue picking with a little bit of wildfire smoke. But then at some point we were like, no, like this is hurting our lungs. But it was a dude in New York in some corporate office that determines when the AQI is too high, right? So it's like we have to govern our labor and everything we do at the level at which the consequences fall most starkly. Which I think is just another way of we sort of see so much in the media, like the market will save us, right? We hear folks are familiar with this idea, like there is no alternative, the thing I think Margaret Thatcher or whatever said in the 80s. And, so we see sort of climate and economy get pitted against each other. And, one of the things I really learned from Movement Generation was this idea that, like, if you look at the word eco, it means home, and nomi means management. So the economy is really like how we choose to manage home. And we've really mismanaged home. When we've globalized the economy, we globalize the mismanagement of home, and all those consequences are raining down on us. So maybe the last thing I'll say is, like, so much of climate journalism we hear is like about what degree Celsius increase we have, or how many parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, particular tipping points, right? So it's true that we're hurtling at these tipping points, the Arctic ice melting, the Amazon rainforest becoming a net carbon emitter as opposed to a carbon sink. But I think what that reporting really misses is that if you live in that cancer cluster outside of the medical waste incinerator that I grew up fighting, or the Chevron refinery in Richmond, or you live in Standing Rock and the pipelines going in, or Appalachian, the first mountaintop blown up, like those are the tipping points that we're pushing past the line that we needed to have held. And so this idea that there's kind of like a global degree temperature increase, or a parts per million that would be okay to tiptoe toward, feels like one of my most frustrating brain exploding moments when I read the headline. So I have other thoughts, but let me stop there.
These issues of not accounting for the causes, right? This disproportionate emphasis on the symptoms or the very visible manifestations, and also trying to set kind of one universal answer of why climate change is a problem. I think those are really crucial points that are really hard to find coverage of. Jayeesha, how about you? Are there other things or things you would echo about issues you have noticed in coverage of climate justice?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo some of what Brooke said. I think for me, there's this kind of dual way that I see reporting happening, both of which kind of are problematic. One of which is one is worse than the other, let's be clear. The super extractive disaster porn, kind of just really taking photos without permission, just kind of really using disaster as a way of being very sensationalizing and getting like all the views and the reads and the eyes that are in the moment of disaster. Often people are looking, right? And that's extremely harmful. I don't really need to share more than just it's very harmful. And that is the dominant instinct. There are reporters and there are folks that, I come in contact with, especially when there are disasters happening in our region, who are trying to be better, right? They are trying to be more accountable. And oftentimes what happens with that kind of perspective, the problems I'm seeing is this kind of resiliency narrative that develops. And that resiliency narrative can also be really harmful because it isn't pointing to those structural perspectives that we're talking about when we really talk about what climate justice is, right? It's like that sure, resiliency, people do what they got to do, but using that resiliency narrative to kind of share these feel-good stories in the midst of the disaster. I know they come with good intention, but that actually makes the issue worse in a lot of cases because, those people down in New Orleans, those people down in Florida, there's just another hurricane, they'll be okay, right? And so it actually shoots us in the foot a little bit with that good intention, because people, the rest of the world is walking away with like, they'll figure it out, they know how. But in the meantime, what's happening? Like my roof in New Orleans, I moved from New Orleans to Florida, I've lost a roof twice in the last 4 years. The roof here at my house right now has a tarp on it because the insurance won't cover it. My insurance will probably go up about 5 times. Insurance in New Orleans, I know a lot of people who are losing their houses because the insurance, that's not a sexy story. That doesn't have pretty, like the disaster porn pictures. It also doesn't really have a resiliency narrative that has the feel good thing. So, but that's the story. Like that's actually what's happening. And I don't see or hear of those kinds of the real ongoing stories of how we are going to kind of really find the solutions. And instead, like Brooke is saying, like these false solutions are what is really put out there as the way. There's some really basic things that are policy things I'm not an expert on, but I know there's some solutions that if like the journalists who are really paying attention to the long-term story could help to amplify so we'd have more public will and pressure for those things, like holding insurance companies accountable, like having more mutual aid networks so that those are actually maybe even sponsored by municipalities instead of what we always see, which is grassroots groups with no budgets just doing what they need to do. Right. There are ways. You look at places like Cuba, which they actually have figured out a way to handle hurricanes because they have brigades. They have a brigade network that the government is like sponsoring, supporting. They activate. It's community driven, but it's government supported. Right. Like we don't have that because we don't have the public will for that. And part of the reason I think we lack the public will for those kinds of things is because we don't have the media kind of eyes and ears amplifying what is happening or what needs to happen at the kind of scale it needs to for the change we need.
Yeah, I really appreciate you naming that issue with, on the one extreme, there's climate doom, there's the apocalypse story and everything is underwater. And at the other extreme, it's too much kind of climate resilience or misplaced hopefulness in the individual being able to rise above it all, which is both not pragmatic and also doesn't really do justice to what is happening on the ground. I also appreciate that you use this word amplify, and that's what a lot of my research has looked at, which is who journalists tend to amplify. And as probably will surprise neither of you nor anyone watching this, in many, many cases in climate coverage, journalists are amplifying statements and reports about climate that are coming from government organizations, from corporations, and academic institutions. So I wonder, Jayeesha, you started to allude to this, but if we could unpack some of the downsides. I think this also often comes from a well-intentioned place for some news outlets that believe that these quote unquote authoritative sources will be able to cut through the potential noise and tell us authoritative facts. But what are some of the downsides of focusing solely on these types of sources when covering climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think those folks that it is helpful to understand the perspective of the government official or the first responder. But to be clear, generally the folks who are the true first responders and the folks who are, the true trusted community leaders for those who are most vulnerable and at risk, those folks are not the people the media is going to, the ones who actually know who the grandma down the street who is on a ventilator when the power goes out and needs the power, right? Those are actually your most valuable sources who know what is really happening on the ground, what is happening to the folks day to day, as opposed to, especially when you're talking about folks who live in vulnerable communities, like undocumented communities where the government ain't going to know what's going on, right? They're not going to know. And so to rely on those solely on those kinds of sources for the stories that folks are reporting when these disasters happen, or when, chaos is going on because of multiple things happening. Sometimes the place isn't just one thing. They might be dealing with, a mass shooting while a climate crisis at, right? Like we are in that kind of an environment right now. So to not build the relationships with community leaders before the issues happen and not having ongoing like relationships, the people I see in this region telling the most accountable and authoritative stories are the ones who have taken the time before things happen, while they're, in the process of maybe even getting into their job and their role, are building relationship, are being, active in community to know who are the players who are actually doing work as opposed to saying things that sound good. Because I think another thing I see happening a lot is, choosing one voice or one person that the media does do, that's like the community voice. So maybe, okay, you have your government people, you have your first responder people, and then we checked in with that one person from that one group. And that's not enough, right? Like one person is never going to be the voice for an entire region or entire place. And so also taking the time, when you were saying about the who, what, where, right? Taking the time to identify the many who's, right? There's actually probably many who's that you need to know. And so really, and I think the fundamental structure of our media landscape in relying on kind of parachuting in and dropping, like, it's really hard to build relationship when you just landed in a place and you've never been there and then you're leaving 4 days later, right? I understand that, but that's kind of the challenge that I pose to the media landscape right now, because that is something that maybe we have all this social media at our fingertips. We have a lot of ways to connect without having to be in person. So what would it look like for a news agency to say, we're gonna like take the time to build relationships, maybe not in person, maybe it is some Zoom meetings, but we know a bunch of folks in these different places that can kind of act as our eyes and ears on the ground because we have a relationship with them. And so that relationship building and the capacity building for those folks. So you could develop a relationship with a bunch of folks in a city, like, for example, let's say Miami. Miami's not great because a lot of people live in Point St Lucie, Louisiana. You know, like 3 or 4 people there. You've, maybe shared a few storytelling tips, a few ways in which so you don't even necessarily always have to be the ones to go down there either, right? You can be informing the community members to be telling their own stories, which is obviously, in my opinion, the best thing, right? You're hearing it from the folks themselves, and they have the skills to be telling their stories and have it not be, again, something that's extractive or exploitative. And I think in doing all of that, building an approach that is more trauma informed and trauma aware, because I think a lot of times when you just have that camera and microphone shoved in front of you when you just lost your house, right? Like that isn't a good practice either. So I think increasingly thinking about that, because when you have developed a relationship with someone, you might think twice before doing that to them. You're like, oh, that might not be the right thing to do right now. So those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Thank you for that. And Brooke, I feel like it's so fortunate that you're here because so much of your work does so much of what Jayeesha was calling out as the need to identify multiple who's and not turn to one kind of token spokesperson for all people impacted. But I wonder if you could speak to the first part as well about how you came to decide not to turn to, let's call them the usual suspects, right? The EPA, the climate scientists, the government officials in the spaces that you were interested in covering, and then how you went about developing the coverage.
Sure, yeah. And I'm totally going to borrow the multiple who's, the many who's. I haven't heard it framed that way, and I'm like taking notes and learning things. Yeah, I mean, I think just like one of the biggest perils, downfalls is you could end up being the vehicle to help corporations greenwash, or to help our federal disaster agencies or our state utility regulator, whoever in that situation is like, their self-interest is to tell you we've got this under control. That, or like, because I've got a product that you should buy, right? And so I think about when I was working with hotel workers, hotels were like, if you've ever stayed in a hotel, you see like those signs that are like, hey, we're in a drought, like save water, don't wash your towel. And when you ask the hotel workers, they're like, no, like this hotel doesn't care anything about our ecosystems, our environment. They throw the recycle into the trash. It's backbreaking labor. Here's all the chemicals involved. And so it's like, you don't talk to the folks closest to that work. I think just getting to this principle of like the people closest to the problem, often what we call the front lines, are the people closest to the solutions. And we saw this again with the energy blackouts in California. PG&E, our deadly, dangerous utility company out here that burned down half the state in wildfires, decided to pivot and just turn off energy as a way to try to socialize their liability, to put that back on to ratepayers. And you have folks with disabilities, the disability justice community, that had to self-organize, who bought generators, bought hotel rooms to keep people's breathing machines on, to refrigerate insulin, mass networks of mutual aid. But if you're only talking to PG&E, that's not the story that you're going to hear. And so, just folks at the grassroots level are the grassroots ecologists with the wisdom to help us in many ways, like remember our way forward. I think I cover a lot around farm workers, and it's just wild how they work for, and some of they're not farm workers, they're like farmers without land is how I think of it. And they're being told what to do by these wineries. They're destroying the ecosystems in the North Bay. But when you talk to them, most of them are indigenous folks from Oaxaca who have or come from other land-based peoples. They're still very connected to their ancestral lifeways and have tremendous multi-generational knowledge about how to caretake water, how to create compost systems, how to do multi-cropping, all of these things. And so I think it's really about just like, how do we center and really see, especially, workers, other folks in this system as the grassroots ecologists. And then, maybe the other thing I'll just say that I think going first to government institutions and corporations and academic institutions misses is that what they see as the solutions, they're trying, what's the way to say this? It's like the scale of the solutions that we need don't always fit the scale of the problem, right? So what I mean by that is like, we don't have power at the global level. So often in climate, you hear about these COP talks, and it's like a social movement, that's not where our power is. And so of course, we're gonna get really weak, insufficient agreements out of those. So I'm borrowing someone else's words here, but the way sort of like, instead of being one huge bowling ball as a movement, what if we're more like a collection of marbles hurling at those pins? And that doesn't mean that the solutions are these small boutique situations, because capitalism has this phenomenal capacity to continue to thrive with experiments happening at the margin. But so many times what we put our energy into is like fighting the bad and not building the new. And sometimes the solutions we need actually start out really small. I'm thinking of Casa Pueblo and Adjuntas in Puerto Rico. Speaking of these like aid organizations, when Hurricane Maria happened, FEMA, it took them a month to get to Adjuntas. And meanwhile, this community organization Casa Pueblo, they had solar panels on the roof. They had a community radio station that was putting out 1-minute messages from folks that could get messages back home to tell people they were okay. And so sometimes it is those small scale solutions that are flying under the radar now that won't always be the small scale solutions. They're actually the way forward, and that we have to figure out how to get at scale. But if we're only talking to these large institutions, we're only gonna hear about the solutions that are like at the big policy level. And we need to really build our liberatory imagination. Those small scale things sometimes put us in the world, make the world we need within reach, and then contest for power, right? But I think that's what we miss when we go to those big entities and rely on them as our only sources.
Thank you so much for that. I think these are crucial points that, talking to FEMA or talking to other institutions with press releases and press conferences, they have a very clear reason to emphasize what is working and maybe not to address the things like delays that are experienced on the ground, that people don't just wait, right? There are grassroots efforts in those spaces that often go unreported. So I want to channel the folks who I imagine are watching this, including journalists who are newer to climate justice coverage, and want to imagine that we have convinced them that there is good reason to really try to center folks who are on the ground, directly impacted, doing the work, and now the journalist needs to do some interviews, to find some sources, to not do the parachute in and parachute out. But how would you suggest they begin?
I mean, I think step one is kind of determining a personal code of conduct of how you are going to do your work. And I think, different people might be with, different reporting institutions, whether it be a newspaper, a television station, an independent indie outlet, whoever the organization is you work for, you can have your own personal code of conduct of how you conduct yourself. And some of the ideas I would encourage folks to think about in that would be things like, committing to cultivating community collaboration and trust when you're going into a community, like being committed to that you don't just go in and do the one-off. You might, if you are filming someone in front of their house after it's blown down, you or someone who commits to checking in on that person again a month later, even though your reporting institution might not be reporting that story anymore, you as a human being treat that person as a human being. And I think that humanizes, again, the relationship. And that's part of this just transition we need is, healing and repair with each other and treating each other as human beings. And the media is just as much a part of that extractive system as anybody else. I think also like honoring the journey while respecting tradition. So really being kind of culturally aware and sensitive when you go into different places and the different ways in which people might be, and being aware of that before you jump in. So taking the time also to, think intergenerationally, think diversely, right? This idea of the many who's. So thinking at all the different levels of what the types of folks that are in a community, the different communities within a larger community, and really honoring kind of all those different traditions when you're coming in. And I think just like emphasizing the multiplicity of truths, right? That there are a multiplicity of truths in any situation. And so how can you honor that multiplicity in the work that you do while telling the clear story? Because it is important that your reader and your viewer understand the story, but it's also important to understand there is maybe many stories within that one. I think treating those stories that you get as sacred and just, holding that sacredness. I think there is a lack of that kind of mentality in media. And so just holding the idea that what we ultimately have at the end of the day are our stories. Like that is what one of our core parts of our being is. And so when someone's sharing that with you, that it is a sacred offering. And then finally, what I shared already about just being trauma informed and having a trauma aware reporting kind of mentality if you are going to be going into these climate disaster stories, climate related stories, which often have a lot of trauma, infused within them. Do the work you need to do to know what that means and to really bring a healing perspective as much as you can in the kinds of questions you're asking, the approach you're taking, right? All of those things can be part of actually treating someone as a human being in one of the most dehumanizing moments that they're having to deal with. So thinking, think of yourself as somebody who is part of this equation. You're not outside of it. And I know journalism ethics office, like, you're not, it's actually, no, you're a human being. You're a human being in this interaction with another human being. And so really taking the time to be trauma informed as you're going into highly traumatic environments.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And Brooke, I wonder if I could pose the question a little bit differently, building off of what Jayeesha just named, which is how did you, first of all, as you were going into the spaces that you were covering in the examples that you shared, how did you, first of all, identify where to go and how to show up in those spaces?
That's a great question, and just +1 huge star on everything that Jayeesha just shared. I think part of that is the storytelling that or the relationship building at the core of the sort of sacred trust that's involved in storytelling. Is I came up as an organizer for like 15-20 years before I decided to doing journalism, which does not have to be everyone's path, but I think that question of like just how do you build deep, long-lasting relationships in this and put that relationship at the center, and there's just no shortcuts in that work. So I think everyone that you brushed off thinking they were just an intern or whatever is the next organizing director of the place you really want to tell a story about. And so building those deep relationships makes a lot of sense. Go to a lot of things in your community that you're not writing about. Just go talk to people, ask them, what are they thinking about? What are they reading about? What do they think the stories are that aren't getting told? And then I think on this question of parachuting, I think one really important question to ask is like, am I the right person to even tell this story, right? So I think about that a lot as originally as a white organizer and, as a white photojournalist. I just may not be the right person to tell the story that I think is the interesting story. And so I think thinking through like, can you pass that story off to someone? Or would it make sense? I've partnered with folks before on a story who don't even have to be journalists, but like, hey, this is the interview I think would be really interesting to do. Would you want to do that with me? I think really reading everything you can about the community before you start writing. So don't ask people to do work to find things or to tell you things that you could find online. I think asking people like what common misconceptions or mistakes are made when covering their community or issue, like what do people most often get wrong about this issue, is a great question to ask. Really basic stuff, but like read every quote back to your sources. Consent is just at the core, or violation of consent is at the core of so many of the injustices that we're fighting. I think, a central question for me is like, how do we put consent back at the center of storytelling? And, I think this question is just around how to not be extractive. I think, obviously there's some like journalistic standards, which to be honest, I didn't even go through journalism school, so I'm not sure I even understand them all, but yes, you may not be able to pay someone for an interview, but I think there's lots of questions you can ask about what are ways to give back. So can you print them up? For me as a photographer, one of the ways to frequently do that is print up, big photos for folks, give people the raw files of the photos. Can you make if you know editors or reporters or other outlets, ask them if they want introductions to other outlets. So just really trying to think about how, like, if reciprocity is the world that we're fighting for, how do we put reciprocity in as the central tenet? And Jayeesha really named, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but like, what's your personal code, or like, what are your guardrails for doing this work? So I think figuring out what that is for you, but reciprocity and consent have been, and I don't think there's a clear, like, this is exactly how you do it, but thinking about those as lines of inquiry as you're moving, like, am I moving with consent? Am I moving in ways that honor reciprocity and the sacredness of story is one way to do that.
Thank you so much for those points. I think this idea of approaching these stories with reciprocity, with a concept of mutualism, right, instead of the extraction and see you next time mentality, those are crucial and key, and all aligned with this logic of solidarity. We are regrettably at time. I want to thank both of our panelists, Brooke and Joy-i-sha, for being here, for sharing such amazing insights, and all of you who are watching. I hope that we can continue this conversation. For more resources from the Solidarity Journalism Initiative, please check out mediaengagement.org/solidarity-journalism. And if you'd like to join our mailing list, feel free to use the contact information on that page. We offer these workshops and free consultations, as well as digital resources on an ongoing basis. So we're here to help as you start to use this solidarity approach. Thank you all.